We're on in three, two, one. All right, here we go. Welcome everybody to the Tower Climbing Grease Monkeys show. I'm your host, Neil Gingard with the Tower Climbing Grease Monkeys. And today we got a special guest with us. His name is EJ Martin. This guy's been around in the wind industry since 2007 and is currently the VP of operations for a company called Longroad Energy. Well, this guy's quite impressive because not only does he do that, but he also makes some sweet skis and is a business owner of a company called Lucid Skis. We're going to get to know this guy, so let's bring him to the show. EJ, welcome to the TCGM show, man.
Thanks, man. Glad to be here. Really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. You're coming to us from Portland, Maine. Is that correct?
That's right. The first Portland.
The first Portland, and that's funny. I've actually never been out that way, but I've seen quite a few of your videos of you guys kind of exploring some of the terrain out there, more specifically with your Lucid Skis company. And I was actually watching some of those videos today. It looks like a beautiful area.
Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. We're here in Portland. You can be on the water. Like my office is, I don't know, a 10-minute walk from the ocean here. But likewise, in an hour and a half, you can be in the White Mountains, climbing along the presidentials or backcountry skiing or doing all that sort of stuff. You can really kind of get lost in Maine, which is something I really appreciate. And there's never lack for adventure here.
You know what? I don't know too much about Maine, but the population can't be that big, right?
No, I mean, in the entire state, there's only 1 million people. And the greater Portland area where I'm at, and that's the biggest city, I think is like 80,000 people. So maybe a little bit more than that. But it's a big state, and it's kind of dispersed extremely well.
Yeah, you're so close to some of these bigger cities, but yeah, you guys are kind of tucked away up there. Do they have any? You guys have some wind energy in Maine, right?
Yeah, we certainly do, and I was fortunate enough to kind of be on the front end of that. I actually started my wind career here in Maine at the Mars Hill facility.
That was back in like 2007.
That's right, 2007, just before COD, as that project was coming online.
Yeah, so EJ and we've got a history. We've known each other for a while. I actually met EJ, and I believe it was like 2008. So after your Mars Hill project, you were working for UPC, I think, at the time, and then I think it turned to First Wind, and then First Wind was the owner of this farm that I was helping construct back then. It was Cohocton Wind, and that was an absolutely gorgeous place, man. Rolling hills, farmland on top of like these black, like the soil was so dark up there. It was crazy. And then we were putting in these huge, clipper turbines that were contrasting the whole environment. It was really an epic experience. I think I remember meeting you there for the first time. But yeah, I've actually known you since then. And then I've worked on projects that at the time First Wind owned. And now you even manage one of the projects that I worked at for 8 years, which is Milford, Utah. So that's a pretty long history. We've known each other, man. And I've been watching you and following you on social and just keeping up with you. And you're running, you're basically running operations for Longroad. And then you've also got this thing on the side, Lucid Skis. Why don't you tell these guys a little bit about what your day-to-day is like as like an operations manager? And then how do you like manage your kind of like your side hustle?
Yeah, so kind of day to day, really in the mix. So I've been doing this thing lately where I've been waking up at like 4:30 in the morning and trying to get an hour and a half to 2 hours worth of work in before I necessarily go into work or I go in to work out. I'll then come in the office. We have built out here in Portland our 24/7 center, so we have people monitoring our projects around the clock. First thing I do is grab a cup of coffee, sit down with the daily reports, see have there been turbines offline for more than 24 hours, our solar inverters down, and to the point where there's anything I need to follow up on or I'm not necessarily clear on, I'll follow up with my team that's managing that. From there, I go into, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but at this point, I'm a vice president. So a lot of my time is spent on conference calls and emails.
Yeah, you were quite a hard dude to get old, like to have scheduled, man. You were on calls like constantly. That's
Yeah,
kind of the day in the life though, huh?
yeah. I mean, today, including this call starting at 9:30, I'm booked until 6 p.m. tonight on calls and meetings and that sort of stuff. So, I do have my fingers on the sites, perhaps more than other VPs in that Milford and Bill Dent, who runs that site.
Yeah.
Um, uh, he reports directly to me, as do our other sites across the U.S.
Yeah,
And
shout
then,
out to Bill, man. Bill is
yeah,
a great guy and is was my boss for a long time and a huge supporter of TCGM. He's not a Facebooker, but he's definitely a supporter for sure.
yeah, I'm jealous he's been able to not dive into the Facebook world at times. I wish I wasn't either, but
So
he's a great guy and a great guy to have managing the project.
so you run through the whole site, you do the whole gamut, like most likely just like a guy that would go into the site or a site manager, but you do it on a level that's a lot bigger. But you're not only managing these solar assets, but you're managing wind assets as well, making sure they're all online. And then you hit the conference calls, and it's pretty much like call after call after call. And like, what
Mhm.
kind of stuff are you talking about, man? Like, I'm trying to
Yeah,
frame up a picture for these guys. So a lot of the guys want to be in the position that you're in, and I thought that's why it would be a cool deal to like interview you, because a lot of these guys are like, I want to be, you know, the operations managers or you know, VPs of ops like you. Like, what's that like?
yeah. So I mean, I just pulled up my calendar. So without going into any sort of crazy level of detail, today I have 3 one-on-ones with direct reports. Had a call with our accounting group to go over some, billing cycles and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I've got calls related to our M&A activities and our development sites, an investment committee call, and a few calls on various O&M contracts that were either in the process of negotiating or just kind of a normal managerial relationship. So today, that's my day. The good thing about renewables is your day is really it can fluctuate based on what happens, right? So if there's a safety incident or an environmental incident or a site goes down,
Yeah, you got to react.
and you got to react to it, right? So part of my job is being able to rack and stack those priorities, and really putting the assets and the people running those assets first. I spend a lot of time asking my guys, how can I support you? Whether it's running things through the organization because maybe they're not getting a response that they need. Maybe I have a connection. I can call a VP at another company to get a little bit of action on an item. Or, I've been working with my hands and in wind, well, prior to wind too, but, for over a decade. And so I've seen some stuff and I'm happy to pass on that knowledge from time to time as requested.
Man, there's so many different ways I want to go with this conversation, but like let's work on like how did you get here? You had mentioned some of your past, like about working with your hands, but you're obviously
Yeah.
an educated guy. Like what was the path that led you into this?
Yeah, so it was definitely a winding path. I graduated college in '03 with a Bachelor of Science degree in marine engineering and a Coast Guard license. That Coast Guard license allowed me to work on diesels, gas turbines, and steam power plants for unlimited horsepower on ocean-going vessels.
That
Um,
totally explains those tattoos on your arms. I was wondering about those.
yeah, that's another story. That was a night in Cabo San Lucas that I'd be happy to talk about. Um,
Yeah.
but so my first job out of college is actually pretty interesting. So I graduated college. I didn't have a job, but I knew they were hiring in Louisiana. So I took my last, I think it was like a couple $100, and bought a one-way plane ticket down to New Orleans
Okay.
because a couple of my friends were doing the same thing, and got hired on with a company called Hornbeck Offshore. And what that company did is they take they take anything and everything out to the offshore drill vessels, right? So they'll take drill mud, drill equipment,
Right.
all of
They're
that
like
sort
the
of stuff.
transporting guys, so they're taking everything out there.
That's right. And so in that role, I stood a shift. I wasn't the chief engineer at that point, but I stood a shift where I was the lead engineer. And during that, you do everything from maintaining the engines to the bow thrusters. The large cats, they were 35, 36, 37 series cats. And
Oh,
just
nice.
kind of maintaining the boat as well as doing the tankerman responsibilities of pumping diesel to those other vessels, mud, and that sort of thing. I did that for a year and a half, and it was a good job, but I was ready to move on, and I took a 50% pay cut to go work on a cruise ship that was partnered with National Geographic, and for a company
So there
called
was just like a glorious pull towards going towards this cruise ship, and it was before you're kind of working in this like more industrial type of environment,
yeah.
and you're like,
So,
well, the grass looks green over here, but the money isn't as good.
the money was not as good, but there were a couple things. One, I had grown up like looking at National Geographic magazine and kind of always wanted to experience what I'd seen in the pages there, and it seemed like a great way to do it.
I even have my
Uh,
kid. He's stuck on the kids National Geographic. Like it's good stuff.
yeah, it's a great organization. And then to be honest, like the average age of the crew on the boat was something like 28 years old. So it was I
That sounds like
made
fun.
less money, but my life was a lot more fun. As
Yeah.
part of that, I was part of that job, right? Like I'd fly to, let's say, Cabo San Lucas to do a 2 month hitch. When I got off the boat, they would either fly me all the way back to Maine or buy me a plane ticket somewhere else. That was the same value, right? So I would either stay in Mexico or kind of travel or do whatever. So it really afforded an amazing lifestyle. No living costs while you're on the boat, that sort of thing.
And like, what are you actually doing on the boat? I mean, it sounds like fun, but like, are you like maintaining this thing, or like
Yeah. So
maintain it?
So these are smaller cruise ships. These are like
Okay.
60 to 100 people cruise ships. And
Those
I was,
still exist.
what's that?
Do they still exist? Those styles and like that
Oh,
size?
oh yeah. There's Lindblad Expeditions is still in business today, and there's a number of competitors for them as well. But yeah, so I was the chief engineer on one of the boats. So I ran everything from the water purifiers to the main engines and also all the hospitality services. So, and of course, our guests were number one. So I could
Right.
literally be putting a head on a main engine and get a call that, hey, 302 has a bad toilet or something like
Right.
that,
And
and have to
I
like
gotta
put
go
it
to
down or send my assistant. So it was a
So there
good
was no
balancing act.
job beneath you.
Oh no, no,
You
no,
had to
no.
do it all.
Absolutely,
So that's
absolutely.
kind of like where you got your, I guess, professional hands-on with mechanical. I'm guessing some electrical equipment as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the great thing about learning on a ship, right, is if you think about it, you're in the middle of the ocean at times with no support. I mean, at the time, internet on ships was just coming out, and you
You're
had
just
satellite.
like the ultimate MacGyver.
That's right. That's right. And so my boss, who was the port engineer, right? Like, I'll just tell a quick story. We had a Caterpillar generator that the governor was hunting like crazy, and ultimately one day just failed. And so I called him on the sat phone, said, "This is what's going on." Caterpillar got back to him and said, "There's no way you can fix that. We need to send out a rep. It's going to be like 4 weeks." He called me back and said, "Well, it's busted. You can't break it any worse. Take it apart and see if you can get it to work." And it took me like 2 days, but ultimately I was able to use your words, MacGyver it back together so that we could use the aft generator. So yeah, I mean, from that perspective, you're encouraged to just fix it yourself. Whether you've got to grab the welder and weld something, or you've got to figure out why this mechanical system is broken.
That's pretty cool, man. So you work on these ships for a while, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you get into wind?
Yeah, so I was sitting on a beach just outside of La Paz, Mexico, actually, in February, and I got a call from my father here in Maine. I own some land here, and a company called UPC Renewables was looking to build a wind farm there. And so he put me in touch with a developer. I said, hey, I'll be home in a few weeks. I'll catch up with you then.
Right.
And, we got done talking about the lease, and I started asking questions about how the turbines worked, and how were they going to be interconnected to the grid, and just, some really technical questions. And the developer kind of stopped me and said, what the heck do you do for a living? And so I told him. He said, you should throw us a resume. I did. I didn't hear anything for 6 months, and I was content at what I was doing. And then one day I got a phone call from the VP of O&M at UPC asking me if I wanted to come shoreside and take a job at Mars Hill being the assistant plant manager. It was another pay cut. I think that was like a 40% pay cut. But I knew it was an amazing opportunity to get.
Yeah. You see some potential, right? You're like, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, at the time I was like 26, 27. I had some bills, but really kind of low cost of living. And
Right.
so,
Did they ever end up building a turbine on your land?
Nope, never did. Never
okay.
did. They just kind of maintained the option, and then ultimately it went the way of the buffalo. But I knew at the time, and I could kind of see renewables coming up as the next big thing, if you will. I mean, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy getting out of thermal energy generation and going into this world. But I could see like, wow, they're selling more and more units every year. There's not a ton of players in terms of medium-sized developers out there that are doing this. It's an amazing opportunity to jump on the train and see where it takes me. And ultimately, that's what I did.
Nice. So you get into Mars Hill and you're this assistant project manager, and you're out there in Mars Hill, and that's in Maine, right?
Yeah, that's in northern Maine. So if you go to Bangor, which everybody thinks is, everybody's heard the term Bangor, whether it's in a song or something else, it's like an hour and a half north of Bangor. It's near the Canadian border. In fact, the Border Patrol would actually use the site access road to go up on the hill and look at the border. So you're literally right on the line.
The Mounties. That's cool, man. So you guys have like up there they had GE 15s with like SSB pitch or something. Did you get to start the project from the very beginning, construction and all that, or did you come in after they built them?
No, I came in, everything was essentially done. They had some minor punch list items they needed to tie off before COD, but I essentially came in right at COD.
And then some point in time, you make it over back to Cohocton, and that's where we meet for the first time. And we didn't really like officially meet or anything. Like I was basically the supply guy that everybody was like, where are these bolts? How do we do this thing? We've already had to build these things twice or whatever. Like, and then I come in, I remember that. I come in like, and I took over somebody else's spot. Like it was already someone else's project, and they're like, "Go clean it up, Neil." I'm like, okay, And so I remember you being there, and then a few other people, and man, those meetings were like brutal, dude. They were like, if you didn't have your stuff in order, we got a crane that costs us, this many dollars an hour. I was like, oh, crap, So
yeah, delay charges are real.
Yeah, yeah, dude. And so you end up, I guess UPC ends up becoming First Wind somehow, and then when do you take on a new role, and what's that role?
Yeah, so the path to becoming a full plant manager was again a bit of a stutter step. So I'd been at Mars Hill probably 3 months, and we were just finalized also the construction of Steel Winds, which is on just outside of Buffalo, New York. And it was the first batch of clipper turbines off the line. We had, I think, serial numbers 2 through 9. And the regional manager who had been filling in at that project was going on vacation or something like that for a month. And so I got voluntold that I would go out there and run that facility while he was on break. And really was, that was a learning experience for, I think, a lot of different people in the industry in terms of, one, it was an interesting site to build on, but two, it was a brand new technology and figuring out how to fly stuff and all that.
Yeah.
Once that kind of tour duty was over, I went back to Mars Hill. This is pretty interesting. So I had a house.
Got to know that
Go ahead.
Clipper machine pretty well, though. Like, I mean, if you be a part of that,
Yeah,
which I
absolutely.
know it was
Absolutely.
like 13 loads and a ton of building on the construction site. It was crazy. Like, it was not easy to build those things in the field, but
Yeah, it was an interesting project for a number of reasons. The interconnection facility there was one of the original switch yards from Bethlehem Steel. I mean, the breakers were actually mechanical rack-in breakers. UPC bought that substation in the deal for $1, and I think whoever we paid the dollar to got the better deal. So that was certainly a challenge. I went back to Mars Hill, and unfortunately, about a year after being at Mars Hill, I had a house fire where we lost everything,
oh,
everything. And
I don't know too many people that have had that happen, but
yeah,
dang.
it was kind of tragic in a way, but I learned a lot from it.
Yeah.
And so, you go through that process, and like 2 weeks after it happened, my girlfriend who I'd met on the ships went back to the ships just to kind of, clear her head of the situation.
Yeah, like
And
my stuff just burnt. I'm gonna go hang out on the ship for a while.
yeah, and that was the completely healthy thing for her to do. So
Yeah.
and after that, she really didn't have much interest in coming back to Northern Maine because I was actually slated to take over a project called Stetson, which is just south of Mars Hill. That
Yeah.
was part of the plan. That was about a year out.
I loved
I
how
called.
Firstwood would like pick out these spots that nobody else was developing. Like that was their MO, man. They would just like the Hawaii thing and then all of these things in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Shout out
So,
to Paul Gaynor for heading that whole thing up, man. Super cool guy and a visionary for sure.
yeah, that business model was certainly interesting. So we built in the places that were hard to build,
Right.
Hawaii, New England, um, because the power purchase prices were high, right? You would get, instead of getting $30 a megawatt in Texas, you were getting 3 times that in some of these locations, in some places more. Um, yeah, so I called the VP of O&M and basically said, hey, man, I have a duffel bag and a girlfriend, and the girlfriend's not coming back to Maine. So you either need to find another home for me or no hard feelings, but I've got to kind of mosey on down the road.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I've got this project in Cohocton, New York. It's going to be our biggest project. I don't think you're ready, but it's yours if you want it. Just know that if you screw it up, I'm not going to hesitate to fire you. Which
That's
is a
quite the
gut,
setup. That's
which is a gut check, right?
great. Yeah.
So, all right,
You're coming in
challenge.
and you're like, I'm challenge accepted. I'm gonna prove myself. I can run the site and I'm gonna do it well. But
I'm
you
going to
had
knock this in the park. Yeah.
yeah, you had some challenges there at Cohocton, man. I mean, I remember that project right after I left or even before or something, they had like they were trying to like commission the whole thing off of generators and it was like blowing stuff up and oh
Yeah.
yeah.
The Finger Lakes region of New York was good to me for a host of reasons. The smallest of which is, I feel very fortunate actually to have taken over Cohocton. So Cohocton did have a host of issues when it first came online.
Yeah.
And I was able to build confidence within the organization and really build my name internally and externally as someone who would be capable of handling large issues, whether it was the project tripping offline or community issues or the Clipper issues we all experienced early in the day when
Right.
high speed cartridges weren't timed and
Made
all that
lemonade,
stuff.
man. I mean, they threw a bunch of lemons at you. You made lemonade and just, served it up.
That's right. And through that process, I was very cognizant of the fact that yeah, these are problems, and I'm putting in a ton of hours, but this is a tremendous opportunity um, to build that name and to be around in case there are greater opportunities in the future.
Yeah. And there were. I mean, look at you now. And so like you run the Cohocton site for a while and then where'd you go?
Yeah, so I ran the Cohocton site for about a year and a half, and a regional manager for the East became available. Um, the person doing that just took another role within the organization, and so I was tapped for that and did that for I think a year and a half, and then the VP position, we went through a couple candidates, and finally, the COO, Michael Alvarez, called me one day and said, "Hey, we've essentially asked you to train the last two guys. Why don't we just give you the role and see how
I'm
you
familiar with
do?"
that.
Which, I get kind of the same conversation of like, it's going to be a stretch. We think you can do it, but just know we're watching. And again, challenge accepted. I'm gonna try to knock this out of the park.
Yeah, and so yeah, you go into this regional thing, and a lot of guys are like that's their aspiration. They want to be regional guys, or they just want to be, the head dog at the site.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then you get to this next thing where you're the VP of operations, and you basically have all of these reports to you, and then have all of the techs underneath that. And that's a huge responsibility, man. And that's got to weigh on you sometimes. I think I read somewhere on either like your Facebook or LinkedIn or something, and you were like, "I'm a ski maker and a renewable energy penny pincher," or something like that. And like that's
Yeah.
really like the heart of your job. Like you have to make sure. I know it's not a ship, but you have to make sure the ship is still able to sail. And so like you have hard times where you got to say no and you got to make hard decisions, and it's like it all trickles down. I mean, what's that like? Like does that weigh on you?
Oh, it certainly does. There are kind of two aspects to what you talked about. So the first, and I think the most critical to any company's success, is the people aspect of this, right? So, um, you know, it's very important to me that the guys that work in my organization feel supported and they feel appreciated. Whether that's things like visiting the site annually to do a road show, giving away turkeys for Thanksgiving. I mean, that those small things are just a sign of my appreciation.
Yeah.
But I fight all the time to make sure that step policies that may be getting set, or larger decisions, the implications of that I'm protecting my team to the extent that I can, when those types of things come down.
It's a hard thing to manage even a small group of people. I would
Mm-hmm.
imagine it's even harder to manage a larger group of people. In Milford, I managed, eight, nine guys
Mm-hmm.
at the max, I think. And that was tough. There was hard decisions doing that. Just those eight guys, I don't even know what it's like to manage more than that, and obviously you have your direct contacts, that you kind of have, and maybe that's the number of them, but to know that the decisions you make trickle down, that's just a lot of responsibility, man. And I don't know if everybody that is aspiring to maybe be in your position is well aware of that and knows what that's going to be like, and knows the pressures that are going to be put on you. I mean, because you have bosses, right? Like obviously, Michael and all of the directors and all that stuff. They're like, wanting you to provide this information and this bottom line and all that stuff, and that's got to be a lot. So I remember looking at the organization of First Wind, and just loving how I felt like a real person. Like I felt like I'm not just a number. I had came from General Electric, and I was like asset number blah 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 blah, right? And then like coming to First Wind and feeling like, oh, this is really cool. And um, I think you guys are doing that as well at Longroad. I mean, at least the core values are the same. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean that DNA is certainly still a big part of who we are. We didn't touch on it, but Longroad is essentially First Wind 2.0, right? So
Yeah.
uh, it's the same executive team from First Wind. The four founders are the four names that everybody would know from that, and then a lot of us were part of the transition to Sun Edison, and a lot of us got out of that for various reasons.
Right.
And it took a while for Longroad to get up off the ground, but we were all happy to get the band back together, if you will,
Yeah.
to try it again.
I remember when I became a member of the first wind team, coming out to Boston, and you got to meet with the CEO, and you got to meet with Paul Gaynor, and he's like, you know, we had I think 15 or 30 minutes, something like that, and he's just like, ask me whatever you want to ask me. And I think the first thing I asked was, how the hell did you pull this off, man? Like I read this, stuff about you and like how you basically like went all in, had like some office space, and then you were just like scrambling to find an investor to, build any wind project possible. And then and he was like, yeah, basically that's how it went. We just, through a Hail Mary kind of thing, but like put in work. I was like early on, and then they found an investor for like their first site in Hawaii. And I was like, wow, that's a pretty damn cool site to build your first one.
Yep.
It was just super cool to be able to talk to him. I mean, I think we talked about kite surfing a lot.
Yeah, I mean that part is still very much relevant, right? So and it goes both ways. So I think some organizations can be very military-like in terms of like chain of command and all that sort of stuff, and really
Right.
kind of limiting access to the C-level suite. At First Wind, as you experienced, certainly here within Longroad, everybody's available. I certainly don't mind if anybody underneath me picks up the phone and calls Michael Alvarez to ask a question, right? Like
Right.
that's certainly their prerogative. And likewise, I mean, Michael will pick up the phone and call a technician at Milford if he sees a turbine down and has a question, right? So we're very open door that way.
We got some questions here. I showed him up. I'll put one up here. It says, Mike Mills asked, obviously he has been successful. My question is, was he satisfied with his decision to the transition to the wind industry from what has been content and familiar, which is so long before that? So basically, are you happy that you made the transition to renewables?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great ride. It's afforded me a lot of experiences that I never would have got if I'd continued working on ships. Um, I think change is one of the hardest things for people to embrace, whether that comes through an opportunity or something outside of your control. Um, but in my life, I've always seen those decisions as like A or B. And once you make the decision, it's not necessarily worth reflecting back on, right? Like, do I miss the ocean? Yeah, that deep blue that you can only experience when you're offshore and you can't see land is amazing, right?
Yeah.
But I am beyond happy with my current position and the over 10 years worth of experience that I've been able to glean. Don't get me wrong, there are some rough periods. If you had asked me that question 2 years ago, probably would have been a little bit different, but um, I'm happy overall.
Yeah, those were some rough times, man. That whole first wind selling to Sun Edison and then Sun Edison going up, like that was tough. It was tough on me. I remember managing a site in bankruptcy, and I remember, dude, like I'll be honest, it had a lot to do with me just saying, you know what, I'm gonna go off and do my own thing because I was like, shit, I can go bankrupt on my own. I don't need to go
Yeah,
bankrupt these jokers. I was like, whatever. And the leadership
yeah,
had fallen apart. It was like, I was like, dude, I just didn't believe in the guy that was running it. I didn't believe it. I was like, dude, this sucks. Like, these are my brothers. Like, I spent 8 years with these guys.
yeah. I will say the hardest thing I've ever done professionally, not to belabor that experience, but you know, speaking personally, I had signed an agreement that I wouldn't leave for a year after the transaction closed.
Oh, right.
So I couldn't leave, right? Like I just contractually couldn't. Um, but I personally was not being fulfilled.
Yeah.
So the hardest decision I've ever made professionally, to go back to your viewer's question, was to leave the team that I had built at First Wind. Like, uh, I'm not an overly emotional guy, but when I drove to one of my coworkers' house to drop off my phone and my computer, it
Oh,
was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I'm including like sifting through my house after it burned down. I mean, it was gut wrenching.
that is tough. And I can understand that for sure. I mean, you put a lot of time in. and effort into it.
Yeah.
I completely know what those emotions are like leaving that behind. And I remember the day I quit, or the announced that I was quitting, and like I thought I don't know, I thought I was gonna get some like big uproar or something, like yeah. And I was like, dude, it was like you could hear a pin drop in the O&M building, and everyone was just looking around. And I was like, and then I was like, time for a joke, Neil. You got to crack a joke. And I was like, well, we're going to see if all those inspirational YouTube videos are worth the shit, because I'm following them, you know? So,
Yep.
yeah, that was a funny thing. Well, Mike goes on to say that, you know, he actually had, here's his comment here. He had a similar experience, you know, getting out of his comfort zone. I think we all realize that the comfort zone is not where you grow.
Right.
And, you know, I think that when I started thinking about interviewing you, I thought these guys are going to get inspired in a way that's going to lead them down a path to figure out, you know, what they really want and how to get it and how to do it. And, you know, not everybody's path the same. You know, there's going to be guys that don't go to college that are just going to be rock stars in this thing, and could be VPs of operations, you know, and even more, start their own companies. And I think that's inspiring. And getting to talk to guys like you that, you know, started off in one thing and then ended up going into another thing like wind energy, and just like hitting it really hard and moving your way up. I mean, I think that's really cool. I know for me, you know, working under you for a while, like I was like, I was always like, how did this dude get to where he's at? Like you want to know the roadmap, you know, like, is that what I want? Is it like, where do I end in this, you know? And, um, it's cool that you able to come on here and like be relatable, you know. And I bet you a lot of those guys out there didn't know that you know, you were like this mechanical guy on a ship, and then you even worked, you know, with your hands like for the first few years and those early days. And you know, people forget that stuff. You know, I've even had people on here like, you don't climb anymore. I'm like, dude, listen to me. The coach, he doesn't play in the game. You see what I'm saying? Like, there's
Yeah.
no way the coach can be the quarterback too. You know, it's like you can't have it all. I mean, I did that for a long time, you know, but
Yeah, and it's not something that, I mean, listen, to those of you out there that are still climbing turbines, nothing wrong with that. That's a hell of an effort. I mean, I've been there. I've carried up the bags while climbing because we either didn't have a lift or the winch system wasn't working. I've climbed, I think, 5 turbines in a day was my record, and I know that's in no way close to what some of your members have done, but I understand what it means to be
still a lot, dude. 5 hours a day.
exhausted. Yeah, I understand what it means to be exhausted at the end of the day. And one of the reasons I think I've been successful is
Good
because I've
feeling
been,
that you
yeah,
get, like that is like,
absolutely,
there's nothing better to make you feel better than like good hard work.
absolutely, absolutely. And although I'm a few years removed from it now, like I routinely will try to put myself in the mindset of my workers out in the field, and use that as kind of a pathway to translate between management and the field, and be that conduit.
Man, I would imagine, I'm just thinking, I'm putting myself in your shoes right now. I would imagine like the toughest thing in your job is just like budgeting and like, what can we do? How do we take care of these guys the best we can? You know, but not like sink the ship and all that. Like, I'm just thinking about that. That's got to be tough, dude. Because I remember asking you for stuff like, hey, can we get this? And you're like eventually I have to go to you, and you'd be like, we just can't. You know, I know that stuff has to be tough for you. You know, you got to be like, shit, I really want to be Santa Claus this year, right? But like I can't, because like the company doesn't have the money, or it's just not the right time, or whatever. I think, you know, you've got to get some of those negative vibes like towards you. I mean, like I know I've sent them your way, like,
Oh yeah,
yeah, EJ,
absolutely.
I can't get that.
Yeah, I mean, it's listen, there's no pleasure in telling people no, right? Like, whether it's a tool or a software patch or whatever it is, but
Yeah.
to be successful, right? Like, I think a lot of people, especially outside the business, see renewable energy as this great thing, and it is for the planet, and for, I think it's the single greatest wealth opportunity of our generation. But at the end of the day, we all have jobs, and the sole purpose of that job is to make money for the company we work for, right? And so to use Milford as an example, right? Like every year we put together an operating budget. That site is expected to generate a certain number of megawatt hours, and the operational expenses are expected to come in at a certain level.
Yeah.
And we've promised to our stakeholders, to our board, to the lenders, that we're going to be able to hit those numbers. And so if you don't take care of that P&L, and you don't take care of managing that project like it was your money, like it was your checkbook, just like you would for your home budget,
Yep.
Ultimately, you're not going to be able to take care of your people or the other stuff, because you're not delivering what was promised. And so you kind of have to, it's a balancing act, right? And I know working with you that you probably got sick of me hearing it, but like, okay, don't just send me the expense, send me the cost benefit analysis. Like if I'm going to spend $100,000, what am I saving? Or what do I get for that money?
Exactly.
And really got to be able to sell it that way, in terms of not spending money, but using money to help that P&L.
Yeah, that's yeah, that project is interesting in its own. I mean, just biggest wind farm in Utah, and not the greatest wind resource. I mean, it's like here and there, all over the place. Some years are great. Some years are like, where'd the wind go? But man, I love all those. I love all those towers up there, and been up all of them. I don't know if I say that reluctantly or proudly or what, but
I'm jealous. I've not been up all of them.
so let's take a step back here from all of this stuff. I mean, well, I guess before because I want to talk to you a little bit about your other thing where you make the skis and all that too. But I guess before we get into that, if you could give any advice for guys that are trying to climb this corporate ladder, and they're starting at the bottom. Essentially, we'll just say a technician is the bottom, and they're trying to get to, let's say, your position. I mean, could you give any advice for guys that are trying to be in that spot?
Absolutely. So a mentor in my early 20s once told me that the best way to get promoted is to understand what pressures your bosses has, right? So if you're a technician working at a site, and you one day want to be a project level manager, talk to the project level manager that you're under and say, hey, like, what are your pressures, right? Like, what is the regional asking from you? Like, can you help me understand your goals and what's going on? And how can I help deliver so you look good, right? And if you do that, and you take that view of like, it's my job to help the project and help my boss, ultimately through that process, you learn what it means to be a project manager, because now you know, like, okay, the people about him care about A, B, C, and D. And so when you go for that interview, you can leverage that, right? You can say, well, I help my project manager do A, B, C, and D. And it kind of goes right up the line. So curiosity is the first thing. I think it's extremely easy. And I'm guilty of this at times in my career, to kind of get in the routine of what you do day to day and not necessarily think about the bigger picture. But if ultimately your goal is to be part of that bigger picture, you need to be asking those questions.
Really, man, good advice. Like some good nuggets of gold in there. I love the part about being curious. I think that's what really killed a lot of techs that I worked with. They just weren't curious enough. They didn't want to learn how the SCADA network worked. They didn't want to learn how, all the reporting worked and all that. They didn't want to know stuff. And so, like, how are you going to go and be me if you don't even want to know what I do,
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, great. There's another question here I'd love to pop up here. This one's from Brendan Wills. It says, what are the biggest challenges Longroad faces in the industry, i.e. tech competency, safety training, market landscape with new technology, repower, etc.?
Yeah, so specific to the wind industry, I think it's certainly matured as a technology, right? Like if you'd asked me that question in '07, I would have said, well, we need conditional based monitoring systems in place, and there's a lot of operational improvements to be made. Those have really been sussed out over the last 11 years. Likewise, I saw safety in there, always a top priority, but there's
Yeah.
been a lot of learning that's occurred over the years. So I feel like that is in a much more solid place. I think the biggest challenge that the wind industry is going to see is going to be pressure from technologies like solar, right? Like we went through an amazing period of growth through the early 2000s for wind. And I would say that most, if not all, of the quote unquote easy sites to be developed have been developed, right? And so,
Yeah, they got
really,
the fruit out there, all those easy Texas ones and those easy Oklahoma and Iowa.
that's right. So, I think at this point, it's part of the natural cycle that we're more dependent on the emerging technologies, right? So, if you can get those V112s or you can get those higher turbines so that you can put turbines where previously the wind regime didn't make sense, but you go up another 20 meters or whatever, there's the wind resource. I think that's one aspect that's going to help. The other thing I think is going to help, and I know a number of you out there are probably working on these projects or gearing up for it, is repowering, right? Like,
Yeah.
I know all of the OEMs are pivoting towards that.
Yeah. What do we do with this aging fleet? Do we repower it? Do we, run it until, we can't run it anymore? Can we just stockpile on parts so we just keep them going or what? Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
you guys, I mean, Milford is constructed the first part of '09. It's aging pretty good and it's getting up there. But yeah, that's a, yeah, what do you do? Like, you got to just
Yeah,
like,
I'm probably a little bit different than most, right? So I drive a 24-year-old car, right? Like, so, I take a tremendous amount of stock in keeping things running and
yeah.
understanding the intrinsic value. But likewise, like, there's some tax incentives for repowering that are meaningful and, need to be considered.
I'm a huge fan of repower as long as we can recycle the stuff a little bit better. I think that's the one thing our industry isn't doing that well of. I mean, we should at least give like the gearboxes or the generators back to the manufacturer. I mean, or for like a low cost or something, so they could rework them if they want. But just like throwing them in a scrap pile, that's ridiculous. Um, we got some good comments in here. Thanks guys for participating and really being engaged in this conversation. I really appreciate it. Well, let's switch gears here for like the last 10 minutes or so, and tell us a little bit about Lucid Skis.
Yeah, so Lucid Skis is a company that was actually founded in '09. I bought into that business 3 years ago. The guys who founded it were looking to do something else and had built a good brand. Um, I grew up ski racing in Maine. I grew up skiing in Maine. And for me, right, like I think all of us work so hard, whether you're that technician climbing 5 to 6 hours a day or you're running a podcast or whatever, and you need something that grounds you, right? And for me, there are something to live for, something that can block out the noise of
Yeah.
work. Because I can't speak for everybody, but for me, when I'm home, I'm still working all the problems at work in my head,
Oh, I'm
right?
doing
Trying to
that
come
too.
up with solutions. So for me, there are kind of three things that block out the noise. There's skiing, riding a motorcycle, because you got to be focused. You can't be thinking about anything else on
No other
doing those
thing.
two things.
I'm totally with you.
And the third is like having my hands making something in a saw, right? And so I knew that I needed that for myself because I do work a lot. And so I started kind of poking around, and I'd originally approached these guys like 3 years before we ultimately closed the deal. Said, hey, I've got a little bit of extra money. I'd love to be part of a team that's making handmade products here in Maine. I have a background in skiing, and I was very fortunate. First Wind had sent me to a class on how to fix wind turbine blades, right? So fiberglass, epoxy,
Oh, yeah.
and
Pretty
composites,
similar.
right? It's
Yeah.
it's exactly the same. So I had never made a pair of skis, but I knew that I would probably screw up the first 10 or 12, and then I'd be able to figure it out. And so originally these guys weren't interested. They were going through another funding round. But 3 years later, they gave me a call and said, hey, if you're still interested, why don't you stop by with a 6-pack? And we drank the beer and we sketched out the deal on the back of a 6-pack container.
Nice.
And so Lucid Skis is based here in Maine. We hand make all of our skis. We make 30 to 40 pairs a year. We're a small boutique brand. And we use a wood veneer on the top. You can see this stuff on lucidskis.com if anybody is of interest. But so it looks like an old fashioned ski, right? Like it looks like your grandfather's skis that you'd see hanging on a wall somewhere, but it's all modern construction. So you've got the poly base, the metal edges, it's all fiberglass, epoxy, that whole thing. So it's kind of that blending of the old and the new.
That's cool, man.
And I and one of my business partner hand make every single pair that goes out the door.
Yeah, I was looking at your website, and you can pre-order if you don't have them in stock. You guys would just basically make them to order, and I think like some of the skis range around like $1,000, some a little bit more, and you make them for all kinds of different terrain. But it did say that you use all like local lumber that's like sustainable, different types of lumber that you use inside of these things, and that you're also making them kind of like for the skier that's in Maine. And that was kind of disappointing, man. I was like, what do you think? I can't use these in Utah or what, man?
We've sold plenty to Utah and Colorado.
I'm going to hook you up with my friend. She runs a store called Gear 30 out at Ogden. And I'm going to connect you two, and you guys can talk. She's great, and they got tons of skis up there, and we're going to go up there in the next couple of weeks and go hang out with them. But EJ, I'm proud of you, man. I don't know if people tell you that, but I can tell you that I'm proud of you. I like what you do. I like that you have passions outside of what you do. And it sounds like you and I got quite a bit in common too, because I'm with you, dude. I get out on the weekend. I try to go as fast as possible on my dirt bike and not kill myself, because like I don't have to think about anything. All I got to do is react. All I got to do is ride that thing, and it feels good. Same thing, snowboarding, skiing, whatever it is, man. I love doing that stuff. Thank you so much for joining the show, man. I think this has been a great opportunity. Thanks for carving out the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everybody that listened.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Grease Monkey Nation, we're out of here, man. We'll see you next time.